Good evening and welcome to the 20th annual Gus and Libby Solomon Memorial Lecture. My name is Natan Meir. I'm the academic director of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. It's a greater pleasure than ever to welcome you to the Solomon Lecture this year because it's the 20th anniversary of the founding of this lecture series, which has brought a wide array of stimulating speakers to our campus to explore the American Jewish experience and the theme of social justice, which was dear to both Gus and Libby Solomon, both of them champions for civil rights and warriors against anti-Semitism and other forms of prejudice. I want to thank Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft, the sponsors of tonight's lecture. Libby Solomon played an important role in the founding of the Judaic Studies program, and in establishing this lecture series, only a few years into the program's existence, Dick manifested his confidence in the long-term success of the program. Dick, I hope we've fulfilled your trust in us. As far as we're concerned, you've been an ideal collaborator for many years. I also want to thank our co-sponsors for this evening's lecture, the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Department of History, PDX Hillel, and the Jewish Student Union. Now I'd like to ask Shelley Shaban, PSU Provost and Vice President of Academic Affairs, to say a few words of welcome. Dr. Shaban served as Associate Dean in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences and Vice Provost for Academic Personnel and Leadership Development before being named Interim Provost in 2023 and Provost last year. We are grateful not only for her thoughtful leadership, characterized by an empathetic approach that truly values the individual people who make up PSU, but also for her steadfast friendship to the Judaic Studies program, including her long-standing involvement on our advisory committee. Dr. Shaban.
Hello. I don't know why they put these up there so high, but I am truly honored to welcome you to this special occasion and to thank all of you for being here. Taking care of one another and opening our homes to welcome guests are fundamental Jewish values that were embodied in the lives and work of Gus and Libby Solomon and are essential mitzvot. My heartfelt gratitude to Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft, whose dedication to nurturing these vital connections through events like this one has proven more meaningful with each passing year. Their ongoing investment in PSU's Judaic Studies program, and yes, Dick, now Elise knows, creates ripples of impact that extend far beyond our campus. As a long-serving member of the Judaic Studies Advisory Board, I have witnessed firsthand how this program exemplifies academic excellence and brings the community together. In times of uncertainty and challenge, it's spaces like this and speakers like Dr. Kranson that become even more precious to us. So tonight, as we mark 2 decades of this remarkable tradition, let us affirm our resolve to maintaining Portland State University as a place where all feel safe, respected, and included. I am grateful to be here, welcoming you back to our Portland State home, celebrating this milestone, and recommitting to the values of education, empathy, and community that Gus and Libby Solomon championed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shaban. And now it's my responsibility to encourage all of you to consider making a donation. to support the Judaic Studies program that Dr. Shaban was just describing, either tonight's event or our program more generally. We're grateful to those of you here tonight who are already supporters of the Judaic Studies program. And if you're not, please consider that it takes resources to offer free events such as these to the public, and we would welcome you as partners in our wide range of academic and programmatic initiatives. I want to thank the people who have been working for months to make this event possible and are here behind the scenes to ensure that everything goes smoothly. Suzanne Van Amberg and Claire Warren. I also want to give a shout out to our recently retired longtime office coordinator, Vicki Mazzone, who worked on the Solomon Lecture in past years with great dedication. I'm pleased now to call upon my colleague, Lauren Spielman, Associate Professor of Judaic Studies, to introduce our speaker.
Hello, as Professor Mayer just said, my name is Professor Lauren Spielman, Associate Professor of Classical Judaism here at Portland State University. It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker this evening and to let you know a little bit about her recent accomplishments. Rachel Kranson is Associate Professor of Religious Studies at the University of Pittsburgh, where she specializes in American Jewish history with a particular focus on gender, class, and religion in the 20th century United States. Her influential book, Ambivalent Embrace, Jewish Upward Mobility in Post-War America, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2017, examines how upwardly mobile American Jews navigated the complex terrain of affluence in post-World War II America. This work has been praised for its insightful analysis of how prosperity created new anxieties within American Jewish communities about assimilation, authenticity, and religious observance. She is also co-editor, along with Hasia Diner and Shira Cohn, of the important volume, A Jewish Feminine Mystique, Jewish Women in Post-War America, which examines the various ways that Jewish women defied the stereotypes of traditional gender roles and created new images of female power and empowerment. Dr. Kranson's scholarship has appeared in prestigious journals, including American Jewish History and the Journal of Jewish Identities. She has received fellowships and grants from institutions such as the American Jewish Historical Society and the Frankel Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. Her current research examines American Jewish engagement in the politics of abortion, and this is the topic that she has come here to talk to us about tonight. I've been told that her upcoming manuscript is titled Religious Misconceptions, which is an unbelievably witty title, and I hope that her as yet unpublished manuscript manages to keep that title. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Rachel Kranson.
First of all, can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Good evening. First of all, let me just thank everybody for this very warm welcome I've had since coming here to Portland, and to everyone who made it possible for me to be here and to offer the 20th annual Solomon Lecture. So first of all, thank you for the introduction. Dr. Spielman, Natan Meir, thank you for the invitation. Thank you to Kelly Martin for arranging my travel, Suzanne and Claire for making sure that tonight goes so smoothly. I'm also the director of Jewish studies at my institution, so I do know from experience how much work goes into creating an event like this. So let me just say how very grateful I am. And finally, I just want to express my deep gratitude to Dick Solomon, to Alicia, and really to the whole Solomon family for endowing this lecture in memory of Gus and Libby Solomon and their commitment to social justice. I am honored and beyond humbled to be part of that legacy this evening. It's really something, so thank you. And finally, I want to thank everybody here this evening for taking the time to learn more about the history of Jews and the politics of reproductive care. This is important knowledge for all of us to have, especially now when access to legal and safe reproductive care is restricted or banned in so many American states. My biggest honor tonight is to be able to share this conversation with all of you. Okay, so this evening, I am going to share just a bit of my research from Religious Misconceptions, again, a title that I also hope I'm able to keep. It's a book that I'm currently writing about the history of American Jews and reproductive politics. My research begins in 1973, the year that the Roe v. Wade decision guaranteed pregnant women a constitutional right to an abortion in the United States. And most of my work focuses on those American Jews who tried to protect this constitutional right to abortion during what we must now call the Roe era. Though, of course, when I started this research, I was not aware that this Roe era was about to come to an end. And this is precisely why, to my mind, this is a history that has real urgency. Because I'm sure, as you are all aware, our current moment is not a hopeful one for anyone who cares about reproductive justice. But even though we're in a moment of repression, I certainly find it heartening to know that there have been many American Jews who have been fighting for reproductive freedom for a very long time. And one reason that I'm so invested in this history is because some of the legal arguments that Jews made to defend abortion in the late 20th century were really good ones. They were really interesting ones, worth considering then. And for a number of reasons, which I will later share, I think their arguments are well worth revisiting and thinking through as we continue to fight for reproductive justice today. I should also say that for the purposes of my presentation this evening, I'm going to assume that most of you don't know all that much about Jewish traditions regarding abortion, that you don't know all that much about the history of reproductive law, or that you don't know all that much about the history of First Amendment law. I know that there are some of you here who know a lot about all of these things. So my apologies in advance to those of you who know a lot about all of these topics. Just my conversations with some of you over dinner showed me that a lot of you know a lot about all of these topics. But I want to make sure that I'm bringing all of you with me, okay? So that's what, I'm not assuming that baseline of knowledge. Okay, so with that, let's begin with an open letter that the American Jewish Congress published in the New York Times in the winter of 1989. And as you can see, this letter asked the American public, did you know that abortion can be a religious requirement? Not just permitted, but required. Some religious traditions, this letter continued, demand that people consider the needs of people who are already born before worrying about the unborn. And some religious communities, the letter also insisted, believe that the life of a pregnant person takes precedent over the life of her fetus. Are you all able to see the slide? I can't see it. I can only see the back of, okay. So with this letter, the American Jewish Congress tried to let the American public know that there were deeply religious people out there who considered abortion to be a moral and ethical act, and sometimes even a religious obligation. And making this point seemed particularly urgent in the winter of 1989. So that winter, the Supreme Court was considering the Webster versus Reproductive Health Services case and deliberating on whether to uphold Missouri state laws that restricted publicly funded institutions from providing abortion services. And many American Jews felt strongly that these restrictive laws undermined Jewish religious traditions that supported and sometimes even demanded access to abortion. The organization that published this letter, as again I know some of you know, the American Jewish Congress, was an influential public advocacy organization that protected the political and legal interests of American Jews. According to community surveys administered in the 1970s and 1980s, 87% of American Jews at the time believed that abortion needed to be legal, safe, and accessible. And the American Jewish Congress was one of many liberal Jewish organizations that advocated for abortion access during these decades, even as anti-abortion lawmakers were steadily chipping away at abortion rights by creating usually state-based legal hurdles that pregnant people needed to get through before they could terminate a pregnancy. Throughout the late 20th century, liberal Jewish lawyers, activists, and clergy consistently advanced the idea that American women had a religious right to terminate a pregnancy, and that therefore abortion ought to be protected by the Constitution's First Amendment. Again, the amendment that guarantees religious freedom. Unfortunately, it was often hard to get lawmakers, judges, and the media to take this argument seriously. And this was because the late 1970s saw the rise of what became known as the religious right, which was a political coalition made up of conservative Christians, mostly evangelical Protestants and conservative Catholic activists. And they promoted the popular misconception that all religious Americans believed that abortion was akin to murder, and that anyone in favor of abortion access was necessarily secular or anti-religious. This framing of the abortion debate made it difficult for any religious Americans, including Jewish Americans, to articulate a position in favor of legal abortion care that was based on deeply felt religious convictions. Another common political strategy of the Christian right, which made things particularly difficult for liberal Jewish activists then and now, was that they claimed to be defending Judeo-Christian values as they publicly opposed feminism, LGBTQ rights, and reproductive autonomy. This rhetoric of Judeo-Christian values did, and still does, a lot of work for the Christian right. It makes their opposition to abortion access seem like a universal religious point of view that transcends Christianity, even though in actuality it is only a very particular conservative subset of American Christians who actually believe that abortion is incompatible with their religious worldview. Needless to say, American Jews who believe that abortion ought to be legal, again, 87% of American Jews in the late 20th century, 83% of American Jews today, see nothing very Judeo about restricting abortion access. Jewish traditions about the origin of life and the ethics of terminating a pregnancy differ considerably from those of the conservative Christian activists who were claiming to speak on their behalf. And American Jews then as now often struggle to let American courts and the American public know that Jewish values and Christian values are not interchangeable. They're really not interchangeable on anything. These are two, very different traditions, but they are certainly not interchangeable on the topic of abortion. So my presentation this evening is going to fall into two parts. First, I'm going to go through the Jewish legal texts and Jewish ethical principles related to abortion. And the reason that I'm doing this is because these are the sources and the principles that inspired the Jewish litigators who fought for abortion access as a First Amendment religious right in the late 20th century. Okay? Then next, I'm going to discuss the ways that the lawyers of the American Jewish Congress harnessed the religious freedom clauses of the First Amendment to try to protect abortion rights. Their approach was very different from that of secular pro-choice lawyers. Most pro-choice lawyers tended to base their defense of abortion rights on the implied right to privacy or the Equal Protection Clause found in the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. But in the late 20th century, American Jewish lawyers were instrumental in formulating a First Amendment defense for abortion rights. Okay, so let's start with the Jewish legal texts. And again, one thing that will be absolutely clear to you after going through this material is that there is absolutely no single Judeo-Christian attitude towards abortion, right? Because even those Jewish groups that are fairly restrictive of when an abortion can be permitted come to that conclusion through a very different means than Christians do. Okay, so let's first go through that material and make sure that we have that. Okay, great. So the oldest source that we have regarding abortion comes from the Hebrew Bible. The book of Exodus talks about a case of accidental abortion, and on this slide is an English translation of that case as it is described in the Hebrew Bible. So basically, Exodus presents us with a situation in which a man mistakenly strikes a pregnant woman and causes her to lose her pregnancy. So not exactly a case of abortion, but it has been used in later Jewish texts to discuss approaches to abortion. If the woman herself in this case isn't harmed, the text says that the man who struck her and caused the miscarriage has to pay a fine. But if there's a further misfortune, or what the original Hebrew text refers to as an ason, and the woman herself dies as a result of the blow, then the case becomes a capital crime, and the man has to pay with his own life. So, according to Jewish interpretations of this case, there's a clear difference between the woman and her fetus. If the fetus is expelled, the person responsible for it gets a fine because the fetus's life may have value, but it's not a full living being. It doesn't have that status. But if the pregnant woman is killed during this fight, then the man has committed murder, a capital crime. Because, of course, a pregnant person is a full living being. Now, Catholic traditions tend to understand this same case in Exodus very differently. In the Hebrew Bible, the word ason in verse 23 means misfortune. This tracks in other places in the Hebrew Bible as well. But in the Septuagint, which was the original Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, created in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and which became the basis of the Old Testament, they translated the word ason to mean not misfortune, but form. And because of this difference in translation, early Christian interpretations of Exodus understood verse 23 to be referring not to the pregnant woman herself, but to her fetus. And early Catholic exegetes, like the 4th century Catholic bishop St. Augustine, understood this text to be making a distinction between a fetus that was formed and between that was developed enough to have a human form, and a fetus that was so early in its development that it couldn't be recognized as having a human form. So early Catholic traditions often interpreted this verse to mean that if someone caused the miscarriage of an unformed fetus, so in their interpretations before the moment of quickening, which is the moment that a pregnant person can feel her fetus move, then it is not to be considered a murder. But if a person caused a miscarriage of a better developed formed fetus after the moment of quickening, then that fetus would be considered to be a full living being, and its death would be a murder, a capital crime. Does everyone understand the difference? Okay, great. And in fact, based on this verse in Exodus, Catholic canon law often allowed early abortions before the moment of quickening until 1869. So even in Catholic traditions, a blanket prohibition on abortion from the moment of conception, right? This idea that ensoulment happens at the moment of conception is a relatively new idea. Meanwhile, most evangelical Protestant leaders don't even consider this Exodus verse when they claim that the Bible is against abortion. Instead, they turn to what Jews would consider more poetic material, like Psalms 139:13, in which the psalmist says that God knit me together in my mother's womb, or Jeremiah 1:5, in which God says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. But Jewish traditions, again, consider these verses to be poetic. They are metaphors. They don't have legal weight. They aren't part of the legal traditions regarding abortion in the rabbinic texts. And rabbinical thinkers never took these verses into consideration when determining when an abortion might be necessary according to Jewish law. Okay. Following from Exodus, most Jewish legal texts do not consider a fetus to be a life independent of its mother's life. The 6 books of the Mishnah, and we're going to start with the Mishnah here, were the very first written books of Jewish law. They were compiled in the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era. And most Jewish law regarding abortion hinges on Mishnah Ohalot 7:6, which says that a person must destroy a fetus that threatens the life of its mother until the moment of birth, when the fetus becomes a baby and its life is as sacred as its mother's life. And many rabbis have interpreted this principle to mean that even if this threat to the pregnant person is psychological and that she's not in physical danger, she is still permitted or perhaps even required to terminate that pregnancy. Okay. Moving on to the Babylonian Talmud, the main text of Jewish law. And again, the Babylonian Talmud is a massive compendium of 63 volumes compiled in late antiquity in the region now known as modern-day Iraq between the 3rd and 6th century. And the Babylonian Talmud, it says a lot of things, but it does say in 2 different places, in Tractate Chulin 58a and Gittin 23b, that the fetus is its mother's thigh, which is another way of saying that it's part of its mother's body with no independent life of its own. One Talmudic authority says in Yevamot 69b that until 40 days of gestation, a fetus is nothing but mere water. So there's a fairly long-standing and ancient Jewish legal tradition to prioritize a pregnant person's life and needs when it comes to the issue of abortion. Now, of course, because nothing is as straightforward as it could be in the Jewish legal tradition. There is also a strand of Jewish law that is more restrictive on the issue of abortion. And this is because of Maimonides, who you mentioned earlier at dinner tonight, the 12th century great scholar. His full name was Moses ben Maimon, lived from the years 1838 to 1204. He was a philosopher, a physician, a Jewish legal expert, mostly in Egypt and Morocco, and to this day he is still considered a preeminent authority on Jewish law. And Maimonides made things kind of complicated, at least on this issue, because he said that an abortion is required, and again, he still saw cases when an abortion would be required, but he said that an abortion would be required in a case when a pregnant woman's life is in danger, because in that case, the fetus would be like a pursuer who is trying to kill its mother. And terminating her pregnancy would be an act of self-defense. But this for those of you who are reading carefully, you'll note that this actually contradicts the Mishnah. Because according to Jewish law, a pursuer is a living being. A pursuer is a full living being who is trying to kill somebody. It is not mere water. It is not part of its mother's thigh. It is a full living person. So in referring to the fetus as a pursuer, Maimonides was implying that a fetus can only be destroyed if it is threatening the life of its mother and not for any other reason. So over the centuries, there have been many rabbis who have said that when Maimonides called the fetus a pursuer, he was just using metaphorical, poetic language. And he didn't mean for that to have legal weight. Because if he did, then Maimonides would be contradicting the Mishnah. And Maimonides, as a later scholar, did not have the authority to contradict the Mishnah, right? He could only interpret it. On the other hand, there have been a minority of rabbis, generally from the more Orthodox Jewish denominations, who have followed Maimonides on this issue. And these rabbis tend to have a stricter view of abortion and say that abortion is required in Jewish law only in cases when a pregnant person's life or perhaps health is in actual physical danger, but prohibited in cases when a pregnancy would cause perhaps psychological distress. So we see kind of the two modes of thought, or the two strands here. So once again, there are a number of things that we should be absolutely clear about at this point. First of all, no matter where a Jewish leader falls on the spectrum of whether or not abortion could be permitted in all cases, or whether abortion could be permitted only in cases where a pregnant person's life is at stake, the way these leaders come to their conclusions is very different from where Christian leaders might even come to those same conclusions, right? And this makes sense because we are dealing with religious traditions that developed in very different ways over thousands of years. There is no single Judeo-Christian tradition. And second, there's a long-standing Jewish religious imperative to put the well-being of a pregnant person before the well-being of a fetus, and to consider abortion an ethical and necessary act if a pregnancy threatens the well-being of the person carrying it. Finally, I'm sure you are all aware that many American Jews who make reproductive decisions aren't necessarily worried about Jewish law or about what classical Jewish texts have to say about the procedure. Most religiously affiliated American Jews today and in the late 20th century identify with denominations of Judaism that take Jewish law seriously, but don't necessarily see it as binding. And instead, these Jews are usually inspired by the Jewish ethics and Jewish values that underlie or inspire Jewish law. So for instance, and here I'm quoting Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, a contemporary prominent activist for reproductive freedom, there is a principle in the Jewish tradition called pikuach nefesh, or preserving life. And the principle here is that saving human lives is the most important thing that a Jewish person can possibly do. And it's a value that overrides or transcends every other Jewish law. And so according to Rabbi Ruttenberg, legal access to abortion is a Jewish religious value because people who lack access to reproductive health care are more likely to live in dire poverty, more likely to stay in abusive relationships, and more likely to subject themselves to unsafe and life-threatening medical procedures as they seek to terminate pregnancies that they do not want. Now, I quoted Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg just now. I hope you notice. I hope you are taking as much joy in her t-shirt as I do. But in the late 20th century, the person who was most often quoted with regards to these Jewish values was not Rabbi Ruttenberg, who was not alive, but instead was Rabbi Balfour Brickner, a very famous Reform rabbi who gave a talk about this before Congress in 1976 that was often quoted by the lawyers of the American Jewish Congress. So back in the 70s and 80s, the lawyers of the American Jewish Congress drew on all of these Jewish traditions, on the legal texts and on these Jewish principles, when they began arguing that abortion needed to be protected not only as a matter of privacy, not only as a matter of equal protection, but as a First Amendment religious right. Okay, I'm sure, as you can imagine, American Jews have a long history of engagement with the First Amendment. And for those of you who might need a refresher on the Bill of Rights, and who doesn't need a refresher on the Bill of Rights, it's good for all of us. The First Amendment promises religious freedom through two mechanisms. First, the Establishment Clause guarantees that American law cannot prefer one religion over another. And then secondly, the Free Exercise Clause blocks any law that would make it impossible or difficult for American citizens to freely practice their religion. And in the middle of the 20th century, so between the mid-40s and through the 1960s, the lawyers who represented American Jewish organizations were some of the strongest advocates for a very strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause. And these lawyers advocated for an absolute separation between church and state. And they argued that American Jews would fare best in a nation that was entirely secular and free of religious influence. Now, in some ways, this was an odd position for Jewish leaders to take, since American Jews at the time and probably since, generally thought of themselves as belonging to a religious collective. So on some level, advocating for a strict separation of church and state seemed to undermine Jews' own ability to influence public policy as religious citizens of the United States. But Jewish lawyers adopted this strategy because they were very aware of their lack of power in relation to the Christian majority. And they understood that in American law, religion most often meant Christianity. And so they believed that any religious influence in American law would result not in shared power or religious pluralism, but rather in coercive forms of Christianity. And of course, they often witnessed this coercion in practice. For instance, when Jewish children in American public schools were required to say the Lord's Prayer or to participate in Christmas pageants. The lawyers of the American Jewish Congress were at the forefront of fighting for the separation between church and state. Their legal arm, called the Commission on Law and Social Action, was founded and led by Leo Pfeffer, a First Amendment expert who successfully litigated many establishment cases relating to prayer in public schools, state aid to parochial schools, and religious symbols on public property. And he was very influential in making it illegal, for instance, for US courtrooms to hang crosses on their walls, and for public schools to force children to say the Lord's Prayer, which of course was a common practice before the middle of the 20th century. So not surprisingly, when Pfeffer and the American Jewish Congress first tried to protect abortion rights, they approached it through the lens of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. That's how they approached most things, right? In 1976, Congress was debating the first Hyde Amendment, which prevented public health care programs like Medicaid from funding abortions. When the House of Representatives was debating passing this amendment, they consulted with Leo Pfeffer, who insisted, unsurprisingly, that the Hyde Amendment should be unconstitutional because it was a violation of the separation between church and state. The Hyde Amendment passed in spite of these objections. But the question of whether the amendment violated the separation of church and state was hotly debated in the press, particularly once the Supreme Court decided to test the viability of these Hyde Amendments in the Harris versus McCrae case of 1980. Anti-abortion activists from the Christian right pointed out that American laws often aligned with religious principles, right? Like the laws preventing murder and theft. They are also found in the Ten Commandments. And these Christian right activists were afraid that if the court decided that the Hyde Amendment was unconstitutional on the grounds that it established religion, that it would undermine the ability of all religious Americans to ever wield influence in the public sphere. This concern gave some Jewish communal leaders pause. Even those who were strongly in favor of legal abortion wondered what impact the Harris-McRae decision might have on the ability for American Jews to advocate for their own interests as religious Americans. Some specifically wondered whether something like U.S. aid to Israel, for instance, might be declared unconstitutional based on this strict interpretation of the Establishment Clause. So in 1980, the American Jewish Congress brought this question of abortion and the Establishment Clause to their Commission on Law and Social Action. And I should say that the brilliance of this commission in 1980 was astounding. It was astounding. I think we have never seen the like since. It was made up of some of the most remarkable legal minds of the late 20th century. And among those who came to the offices of the American Jewish Congress to consider this very question of whether abortion restrictions violated the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment were, first of all, the renowned reproductive rights lawyer Harriet Pilpel, and none other than the notorious Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who then was a professor at Columbia Law School. And I have to say that looking through the records of these meetings was a rare treat for me as a historian. Ginsburg's role in these discussions was particularly fascinating. She refused to take a position. She only just kind of poked holes into other people's arguments in her very special, brilliant way. But what Pilpel argued very strongly was that the American Jewish Congress didn't need to run the risk of arguing for abortion rights through the Establishment Clause, because what they really should be doing was throwing their weight behind the implied right to privacy found in the 14th Amendment, which is how the court argued Roe v. Wade in the first place. And it makes sense that Harriet Pilpel argued this, because one of Harriet Pilpel's many claims to fame was that she was actually one of the architects of this successful strategy that secured the right to birth control and later abortion by claiming that the 14th Amendment had an implied right to privacy. So she was the architect of this argument. In any case, what ended up happening was that between 1979 and 1980, most major American Jewish organizations, including the American Jewish Congress, decided that they would no longer argue that abortion restrictions were unconstitutional on the grounds that they violated the separation between church and state. And then the following June, the Supreme Court opinion in Harris versus McRae explicitly rejected the idea that abortion restrictions violated the Establishment Clause. So this argument was dead in the water anyway. But in 1989, when the Supreme Court tested yet another set of abortion restrictions in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, the lawyers of the American Jewish Congress, in coalition with other liberal religious groups, developed a different First Amendment argument for abortion access that was based, again, not on the Establishment Clause, but on the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. And just to refresh your memory, again, it's always important to refresh our memory of the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. The Free Exercise Clause guarantees that American law will not prevent American citizens from freely practicing their religion. And they worked with Harvard law professor Martha Minow, another incredible Jewish legal mind, to submit an amicus brief arguing that abortion restrictions prevented Jews and other religious American citizens from turning to their own religious conscience when considering whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. The Supreme Court justices in 1989 did not address this free exercise challenge during the Webster case. They ignored it. You should know, this does happen all the time. They they ignore amicus briefs. Sometimes they don't. And to this day, the Supreme Court has never explicitly addressed the issue of whether religious exemptions can be made to guarantee access to abortion. So legally, this First Amendment approach ended up being something of a dead end in terms of late 20th century reproductive rights. That being said, this approach to the First Amendment represented a real change in terms of liberal Jewish political strategy. For decades, liberal American Jews had argued that their interests as a religious minority depended on the separation of church and state and a secular public sphere, free of any and all religious influence. But to gain leverage on the abortion issue, they insisted that American law ought to accommodate Jewish religious traditions that permitted abortion. And they began to insist on their rights as religious citizens. This strategy signaled a certain amount of confidence on the part of religious Jews that judges and lawmakers would take their moral authority as liberal religious Jews as seriously as they took the moral authority of conservative Christians. Essentially, liberal American Jews decided to place their trust in an ideal of religious pluralism that offered all religious groups equal access to influence and power. But the fact that this strategy did not succeed suggests that liberal Jews and conservative Christians were not competing on an equal playing field in the debates over reproductive rights. And the fact that abortion access has only grown more restrictive in the 21st century shows that nothing much has changed in this regard, and that the privilege of conservative Christians remains alive and well in the American political sphere. So on that sobering note, let me just answer the question that I imagine at least some of you may be thinking, which is, why do I care about all of this legal history from almost half a century ago? And why am I spending my time deep in the dusty archives of the American Jewish Congress? And I can tell you they are actually dusty. Like, I have allergies, I know this. Why do I bother thinking about this failed legal strategy to secure reproductive rights? It was not only because I can't resist putting a picture of RBG up on the slide. I do have another reason. So the reason for this is because these late 20th century legal arguments are still every bit as relevant as they were back in the 1980s, if not more so. The current Supreme Court, especially since the installation of Amy Coney Barrett, has been remarkably supportive of First Amendment claims that draw on the Free Exercise Clause, and granting nearly all claims based on the free exercise of religion. Of course, these claims are coming from conservative Christians, right? The scholars at the Law, Rights, and Religion Project at Columbia Law School have argued that our current court has, and this is a quote, created a hierarchy of constitutional rights with religious rights at the top, and many state courts are following their lead. So the question that many legal scholars have now is, has our more conservative judicial system backed itself into a corner? Because now that Roe v. Wade has been overturned and abortion is no longer guaranteed in the US under the 14th Amendment, lawyers are trying to figure out if there are other amendments, perhaps the First Amendment, that could guarantee abortion rights. For instance, there are cases pending right now in Kentucky and Florida and Indiana in which religious plaintiffs, including mostly actually Jewish plaintiffs, are arguing that abortion restrictions are a violation of their religious rights under the protections of their state's Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which are state laws that build on the protections of the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. I'm following the Indiana case especially closely because I was part of a group of religious historians who submitted an amicus brief to the court demonstrating that the Jewish plaintiffs' concerns about their religious rights on this issue were sincere and real, that they weren't just an invention that they came up with after Dobbs, that American Jews have been arguing this for nearly half a century. Now, time will only tell what kind of an influence these cases will have, if a case like this will ever go to the Supreme Court. But if it does, the justices will have to explicitly address the question of whether liberal Jews have a First Amendment right, or really whether any Jews have a First Amendment right to terminate a pregnancy based on the Free Exercise Clause. And if the court denies Jews that right, which they probably will, it's going to force the American public to really consider what religious freedom means in America. And if the guarantees of the First Amendment even apply to non-Christians or to anyone with a uterus. When these cases move through the courts, I want the legal actors and political actors and lawmakers who are fighting for abortion rights to be very aware that American Jews spent the last half century fighting for a model of religious freedom that includes every person's right to turn to their own religious conscience when deciding whether or not to terminate a pregnancy. And I want them to be able to draw from those decades of legal experience to make their own arguments stronger. So this research is my own offering to the lawyers and the activists and the lawmakers who are on the front lines of that fight. But we can only analyze these arguments if we go back into those dusty archives and we know about them, right? We can only learn from these arguments if we understand how and why they failed the first time around. So that is what I have for you. And now I am really excited. Can you hear me if I step away from? No? Okay. Oh, that's even better. Because now I really want to hear from you, and I want to have a discussion, and I feel like there shouldn't be a podium between us when we start to discuss these issues. So thank you all, first of all, for listening. Thank you all for thinking about these issues, and now I'd really like to hear from you and get a discussion going.